For this video, we're going to be looking at a historical sketch. And the reason we're going to be doing this is not so much just to kind of look through history and whatnot, but I believe that looking at the events that take place between the classical era, what is known as the classical era, where the Greeks and Romans were predominating in the philosophical thought of the day, all the way through medieval times into the period known as the Enlightenment, even unto today, or more modern philosophy, we can see a progression. We can see a progression or a development in thought. It's not just people throwing things out willy-nilly. It's that there's a definite connection between the philosophy of a day and the historical context in which it arises. And I think it'll help shed some light and make some sense of some of these philosophies that we'll be looking at. We're going to be getting into some more modern philosophies as the remainder of the course goes on. But in order to understand them and understand why they're significantly different from those either the ancient eras or the medieval period and things like that, we need to understand what were the questions that people were dealing with, what was the historical situation like, and so forth. So we're going to look at this brief historical sketch, and of course this isn't a history course, so basically this is basically a broad survey. We're not going to get into a lot of details, and I'm not going to require you to remember a lot of dates, but just some major events, major movements, and we will see how philosophy progresses over this period. Well, we're going to start by going backward a little bit and covering what is known as the classical era. Sometimes people will refer to this as the Hellenistic era, although I think that's a misnomer, because the classical era encompasses not only the thought of the ancient Greeks, but also comes forward into and also includes a lot of Roman or Latin thought as well. So the classical era, though, is characterized by the time between the pre-Socratics and the rise of the medieval period in roughly the 4th to 5th century AD. So that's generally the classical era. Now the classical era is composed mainly, at least in the Western world, of the Greeks and Romans, and it is predominated by their thought. First the Greeks, and then as Alexander the Great spreads Greek culture and Greek language throughout the Mediterranean world, on his heels, it's a century or two later, but on his heels come the Romans, and the Romans take over this area that Alexander conquered at one point, but they don't try to Latinize everything. So what they do is they leave Greek culture in place because it's already in place. They leave the Greek language, which at that time is sort of like a trade language or the lingua franca of the place in that day. Throughout the Mediterranean world. They also copy Greek architecture. They make use of that. They do something a little bit different, though, than the Greeks did. They unite everybody under Roman law, under Roman rule, and they develop a lot of infrastructure improvements, and so are able to govern better. So the Romans sort of improve on that. That allows Greek culture to flourish throughout the Mediterranean world, and the philosophy of the Greeks also gets imported into the Roman world as well. Now, just in general, just to give a brief and super simplistic description of what's going on there, is that mostly everything is borrowed from the Greeks. The Romans borrow mostly everything from the Greeks. Their architecture, their art, their philosophy. However, they do put a Roman flair on it in some ways. But whether you're talking about the Greeks or whether you're talking about the Romans, one of the significant things, or at least significant for the purposes of our discussion, one of the significant things about both is that they both thought about things, about the world, in terms of or in reference to the gods. And one could say either gods or God or fate or something of that nature. In other words, what they had in common, both the Greek and the Roman culture, is that they believed that there was something out there that transcended human beings in order to give meaning or purpose or value to life. And so we saw, for example, in Plato, we saw his belief in the existence of the forms, and the forms were ideas that transcended the material world. And it was the forms that gave us meaning, it's the forms that gave us purpose. what we also saw in Aristotle. Aristotle believed, and he reasoned his way back to the concept of an unmoved mover, that there is a God who is out there that gives meaning to and purpose to life. There's a reason that we exist. That's where we find our meaning. That's where we find knowledge. That's where we find purpose. Even those who were not so philosophically inclined, nevertheless, they believed in a pantheon of gods. And so they thought in terms of transcendent value. They believed that something that was above them, that sort of gave them dignity, gave them nobility, gave them meaning and purpose and knowledge. And so that was a generally accepted worldview among the Greeks and Romans in the classical era. It was something that drove them to aspire. It's something that encouraged creativity, encouraged the development of arts and philosophy and so forth, because they believed that there's something out there that could be known. There's something outside of themselves that could be understood. There was a world out there that transcended them. There were the gods that transcended the world, and they thought of things in terms of this transcendence. Now that becomes important, and I think that it's as we'll see as we move on, that it's the challenge of that transcendence that brings us to where we're at today, and we'll see that as we go on, exactly what I mean by that. Well, as we move from the classical era, and we're talking about 4th or 5th century AD here, we move into a time in history known as the medieval period. And there are a lot of developments that happened during the medieval period that really bear on what eventually takes place and gets us to where we're at today. Now, the medieval period is often looked at as the Dark Ages, and it actually is the largest span of the eras that we'll look at. It's the largest span of time, but it's often called the Dark Ages, but I think that's a misnomer given to it by people who afterwards say that they have been enlightened, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But anyway, a lot of things happened during the medieval period. For the first several centuries, what we see sort of dominating the landscape is this transition between the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire becomes weaker and weaker and weaker. Eventually it's going to collapse, but it doesn't just automatically collapse overnight. It sort of dies a slow death, if you will. It gets weaker and weaker and weaker. Well, along about the 4th century or so, 4th to 5th century, we have the Roman Empire becoming more or less Christianized. Earlier than that, we have the Council of Nicaea. That's along about 320s AD. And the Council of Nicaea is where the Emperor Constantine declares Christianity to be a tolerated, he does this, he declares it to be a tolerated religion. He calls the Council of Nicaea, and then he begins to hammer out, the church fathers begin to hammer out some of the doctrinal positions of the church. Well, without getting into the weeds there, one of the things that's significant about this is that before this point in time, before Constantine, Christianity was a persecuted religion. They refused to burn incense to the Roman Empire, and as such, they were looked upon not only as religious heretics, but they were looked upon also as as sort of an unpatriotic group of people as well, because they're not wishing the best for Rome. They didn't pay their homage to the emperor, and so anyway, they were a persecuted people up until Constantine. Constantine issues this Edict of Toleration, and after him, Christianity experiences maybe a bump in the road or two, but later on in that century, it becomes the state religion of Rome. And to the point now where instead of being this sort of back alley movement, it's in the forefront. It's no longer in the shadows. It's out in front of things. In fact, in many cases, people would convert to Christianity in order just to gain political status. They would join a church and this sort of thing. But anyway, Christianity goes from being this persecuted religion to being the state-sanctioned religion within a couple hundred years here, and that really kicks off sort of the medieval period, where we have a lot sort of developing. Now, when that happens, Christianity is a church. It isn't a bunch of different churches. Yes, there's a lot of different churches, but it is considered a singular movement. It's one body, right? But during the course of several hundred years, that one body begins to develop two sort of polarized theologies, even within the Orthodox camp. Within the camp of what is considered Christianity, they had a lot of heresies that were outside. But even in the camp of what is generally considered Christianity, there develops this big sort of split. They are centered initially around the Alexandrian school, which is in Egypt, and the Antiochian school, which is in modern-day Syria, or what's known as Syrian Antioch. And these different schools basically have arguments, differences of theology, differences of how they think the church ought to be set up. They just have a lot of differences, and it comes to they eventually migrate. And the Antiochian school is centered in Constantinople, which is in modern-day Turkey. It's actually the modern-day city of Istanbul in Turkey. And then the Western Church eventually becomes centered in Rome, and that's what we know today as the Roman Catholic Church. So the Western Church becomes the Roman Catholic Church. The Eastern Church, centered in Constantinople, becomes the Eastern Orthodox Church, and each of them have their respective church leaders, with the Pope in Rome and the Patriarch in Constantinople, and they begin to gain power in either place. Well, what happens after so many centuries of this building up of difference in doctrine and difference in understanding, is that eventually it comes to a head, and in 1054 AD, there's what is known as the Great Schism. That's what history remembers it as, the Great Schism. And the Great Schism basically is when, make a long story short, the Pope in Rome excommunicates the Patriarch and everybody who follows him, and the Patriarch in Constantinople excommunicates the Pope and everybody who follows him. And so what we have here is like the first church split. The church breaks in half to East and West, with the Catholicism being in the West and the Eastern Orthodox in the East. And it continues on for a couple hundred years anyway. But these two groups basically oppose one another. They don't consider the other person or the other group as a valid expression of Christianity. One other thing that we see developing there is a linguistic difference. The Eastern Orthodox Church speaks primarily Greek, whereas the Western Church speaks primarily Latin. And so we've got the Eastern Orthodox worshiping in Greek, we've got the Western Church, the Roman Catholic Church, worshiping in Latin, and that's yet another distinction between them. Well, this goes on for a couple hundred years, and about the same time that the split happens, the Crusades begin. And the Turks come up through the Levant, which is modern-day Israel and Jordan. They come up and they're conquering, and they conquer Jerusalem. And the interesting thing about Jerusalem in that day, in the first millennium, the beginning of the first millennium there, or the end of the first millennium, is that it's a very pluralistic place. Actually, the three great monotheistic religions of the world, right? The Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, all have people there. They all have an interest in Jerusalem, and at the time, they dwelled in Jerusalem in relative peace. And of course, you have different ideologies dwelling that close to each other. You're going to have skirmishes here and there, people fighting and whatnot, but it was more or less peaceful until the Turks came in. And the Turks came in and they invaded Jerusalem. They put Christian, Jew, and Muslim alike to death if they didn't convert to their brand of Islam. And they began to threaten to go through the Cilician Gates up into modern day Turkey. Back then it was considered Asia. But the churches, both East and West, began to get involved in what we now today remember as the Crusades. And the Crusades last, they're a series of wars. It's not just one, right? But they last for the better part of 500 years, 400 or 500 years, from the late 11th century all the way through the 16th or to the 16th century, or the beginning of the 16th century, or thereabouts. And so there's all this fighting that goes on, And there's atrocities, terrible atrocities committed on both sides. But there, toward the end, what ends up happening is that the Turks are winning, the Muslim forces are winning, and they're actually expanding into Turkey, and they're threatening to move on into move their way through Eastern Europe, maybe even on into Western Europe. So there really is a significant threat, a military threat. Well, the people in Constantinople are a bunch of scholars. For the most part, you've got a lot of religious folk up there. You've got priests. You've got scholars. It is a cultural center of that region, right? And whereas Rome served to be the cultural center of the region in the West, cultural region in the West. Well, the people who are in Constantinople, they realize that if they stay where they're at, in all likelihood, the Turks are going to come in and not only kill them, but also destroy all these wonderful works of art, burn all the libraries full of scrolls and all of the knowledge that they've accumulated throughout the years. They're going to put an end to the culture of the people there and institute their own culture, right? So they do what anybody would do who doesn't want to fight and who wants to preserve. They leave. They begin to migrate away from the war so that whatever happens, whether win or lose, they're going to be safe. The history and the culture are going to be preserved, and so on. So they begin to migrate west. The people in Constantinople and surrounding areas. They begin to migrate west, and as they go west, they take with them their architecture, the architectural ideas that they had, the culture that they had, the music, the poems, the literature, all of these things. They take that with them, and in addition to this, they take the original sources, or as close to original as we get, Greek copies of ancient Greek philosophers and Greek copies of the New Testament, which, by the way, was written in Koine Greek originally. And so they take all of this with them, and they begin to migrate west. And if you think about it, a number of scholars migrating west, and they want to go and they want to live in a culture that is similar to theirs, with ease of access to all of the major writings of the day and the different ideas that are floating around and different philosophers. Where are they going to go? Well, they're going to go to some place that rivals Constantinople. And indeed, they end up going to Rome and other various places in Italy. And so that it's this migration of people who are from the Eastern Orthodox mindset, or the Eastern Europe migration as they come west, and they bring all this culture with them that sparks what is known as the Renaissance. The Renaissance, that word technically means rebirth, and it's this migration of the Greek-speaking world from the east to the west that sparks this Renaissance in the West. Renaissance means rebirth. Rebirth of what? Well, a rebirth, in the opinion of the people who are in Rome and in Italy, it's a rebirth of the classical era, a rebirth of the golden age of philosophy, the golden age of architecture, the golden age of that the Greeks and the Romans had going on. All in the wonderful accomplishments of both of those empires. And so the Roman world enjoys this Renaissance, this rebirth of knowledge, as all of this culture is brought into them. And of course, it doesn't stay Latin and Greek. It sort of gets molded together, and we have this culture of the Renaissance that goes on. And in this culture, there arise a group of thinkers known as the humanists. They're known as the humanists. And now, if you think about people who refer to themselves as humanists today, it's a much different connotation, because humanism, as it is today, means or refers to a people who believe that human beings are the measure of all things. That's what a humanist typically is. In other words, the humanist today typically says, we don't have to go outside of ourselves for truth. We are the measure of truth. And so human beings are the measure of all things. That is a modern humanist. But that's not what these humanists are. When we're talking about the period of the Renaissance and of the Protestant Reformation, the humanists are those who believe that we have to go back to the sources. The term that they coined for this in Latin is ad fontes, and it means back to the source. And what do they mean by that? Well, with this influx of Greek literature that has been coming in from the Eastern culture, they begin to say, look, they recognize, look, we have Aristotle and Plato, we have those in Latin, those are translations. We have the New Testament in Latin, that's a translation. The original for all of that work was all in Greek, and these people are bringing these Greek manuscripts with them. So they considered the Greek manuscripts to be of more importance than the Latin translations. And the reason that they consider them to be more important is because, I mean, let's face it, whenever you translate from one language into the next, you're going to lose something. You're going to lose something of that translation. Some of the meaning has been lost. Some might be altered. There's always going to be a bit of nuance that you don't catch. The idioms are different and all kinds of things. If you're bilingual, then you know that to be true. We can create a functional translation and a very good translation even, but it's never a one-to-one. It's never a one-to-one transfer of meaning. So this group of scholars, these humanists, begin to search through the Greek text and begin to notice certain discrepancies between the Greek texts and their Latin translations. Now, along with this this movement, which we'll get back to them in just a minute, along with this movement, what we also see is the rise of some of the natural sciences. And the Copernican revolution takes place, for example. And the Copernican revolution is a movement. It started under Nicholas Copernicus, who he was a sort of a stargazer, and as he looked out into the stars, he was a scholar. He understood that the church for very long, and this even goes back before the church, but they had adopted what is known as the geocentric model of the universe, which is the idea that all things in the universe revolve around the earth. The earth is at the center. All things revolve around it. That's what Ptolemy had originally proposed. And then later on, the church came along and said, yeah, that's what the church is going to teach. Therefore, they put their stamp of approval on it. And it was taught as scientific fact. Well, Copernicus got to thinking about the phenomenon in nature. Of course, he didn't have a lot of the technology that we have. He didn't have hardly any technology. But imagine that, wouldn't it be better explained, what we see happening, wouldn't it be better explained if we were to understand that that not everything revolves around the earth. Rather, the earth revolves around the sun. Everything in the solar system revolves around the sun, and so forth. That would be a better explanation. And so he proposes this idea. Of course, it's not very popular, and it might even get him killed or threatened. But nonetheless, Copernicus started something off. Now, the interesting thing about this is when Copernicus first mentioned this, his theory actually did not make predictions as well as the Ptolemaic theory did. Because he had some discrepancies in his philosophy, his understanding, and whatnot. But later thinkers, Brahe and Kepler and Newton, and most importantly Galileo, come along, and they begin to formulate different aspects, working from a Copernican model, begin to formulate aspects and demonstrate that, yeah, wait a second, we might need to make some tweaks here. We might need to change some things here, but this model actually does explain things much better. And it was Galileo who first looked through his telescope. I think that he was glimpsing the moons of Mars, which was something that it wasn't Mars, it was Saturn, I think, or something of that nature. But anyway, he gets empirical, verifiable evidence that yes, Copernicus is true, and the church and Ptolemy is wrong. Well, that doesn't go over well, and he sort of recants, and some of his stuff doesn't get published till after he dies. But this is a major blow to the authority of the church. You see, because up until this point, again, we talked about in the classical era, people looking to a source of transcendence for meaning and purpose. Well, that was true of the medieval age as well. People looked to the church as the source of authority of all knowledge and meaning and purpose, and actually even governing authority as well. But when the Copernican revolution begins to get underway and it becomes to be pretty manifestly evident that what they're saying is true, the church, it deals a huge, tremendous blow to the church's authority as it relates to the scientific world. And imagine that you're living in this era, and you've believed all your life, the church has taught you this all your life, and you've trusted them all your life, and all of a sudden you find out the thing that the church was wrong on, or the thing that you thought you were told was true, the church is wrong on. Well, that threw everybody into sort of threw everybody for a loop, because the church is where we go to get the authority for what is going on in the world. It's what defines the world for us. Well, that happens. In the Copernican revolution, severely undermines people's faith in the church to describe the natural world around us and to interpret properly the natural world around us. So it challenges the church's cosmology, or their view of the world. Well, along come the humanists, and among the documents that they were reading or that they had in relationship to from that they had translated in Latin but came from the Greek, among those was the Greek New Testament. The New Testament was originally written in Greek. It was translated in Latin by Jerome early on. It was actually translated into several different languages early on as the early apologists spread throughout the Roman Empire, and it was translated into several. But one of the major ones was Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin so that it could be read by pretty much anybody at that day, because it was Rome, so everybody spoke Latin. But as Latin became more of during the Middle Ages, the Latin became more of a technical language that was used by scholars than it was a language that was commonly spoken. But it was the language that was used in the Western world, and until the point where all these Eastern texts come into contact with it. And as the humanist philosophers began to sit down and compare the manuscript of the New Testament in Greek, which is what it was originally written in, to the Latin translation that Jerome made, what they concluded was, while Jerome's translation was fairly reliable, there were some serious significant doctrinal differences that basically, if you were to understand them as they were understood in the original language, undermined a lot of the doctrinal practices of the church. And so these humanist philosophers during this time began to, a skepticism as it relates to the church's ability to determine theologically what was true and what was not, begins to pervade society. And so we have for example, Martin Luther in Germany. We have Ulrich Zwingli raising up in Switzerland, and we have the radical reformers raising up in other places, the Huguenots in France, and just all kinds of different movements starting in different places, but all with sort of tracing the same trajectory back to a group of scholars who were not connected to one another, but as they reached the same conclusion that the church was erroneous in much of their practice. And so they start waging the Reformation. The Reformation is accredited to Martin Luther, although it began before him, but on October 31st of 1517. And what happened then was Luther was challenging the practice of the church of selling indulgences. And he says that's nowhere to be found in the Bible. Where do you get that idea at? Indulgences, of course, was where the church would, you would pay them money and they would give you a certificate that said a certain amount of years have been taken off of purgatory. So you don't have to go to purgatory for X amount of years to pay for your sins. Well, Luther comes along and he's like, okay, where's purgatory at in the Bible? Okay, where are indulgences at in the Bible? And he challenges that. Well, he creates what's known as his 95 Theses. And he nails them to the chapel door of Wittenberg College, where he serves as a doctor of philosophy and theology. And he's a Catholic monk, and yet he's challenging the Catholic Church on this point. But what he originally intends to be nothing more than an academic debate, what ends up happening is that some of his followers get a hold of this, and right about the same time, you've got the Gutenberg press being popularized, and they basically make a bunch of photocopies and they publish it for him, whether he likes it or not. Long story short, the Pope excommunicates him, almost has him killed. He is quarantined by his ruler, Frederick the Great, I think is his name. Anyway, he's quarantined off into his own place where he creates a translation of the Bible in German, which, by the way, was illegal at the time. It was illegal to translate from the Latin to any vernacular of the people, any common language. But Luther does it for German. William Tyndale does it for English. Tyndale gets burned at the stake for it, but his translation goes on nonetheless. And people begin to challenge the church's authority in the arena of theology. That's like going to their home court and challenging them. So now they've been challenged in terms of their ability to define the universe through science. They've been challenged in their ability to properly interpret the Bible as it relates to theology. And then along comes a guy by the name of Henry VIII. And Henry VIII he's best remembered, at least nowadays, for his sort of scandalous private life. But Henry VIII, originally, when Martin Luther started writing what he did and getting his Lutheran Reformation underway, Henry VIII came out very much very much critical of what Luther was doing. And as such was awarded by Pope Leo X, he was awarded the title of Defender of the Faith, which the English monarchs carry to this day. They are the defenders of the faith. Well, Henry VIII then goes on. His wife, his name is Catherine of Aragon. And Catherine is a princess of the King of Spain. Well, to give you some this is just a little bit background information. So what ends up happening is that Catherine, she was, going back a few years, Henry was never supposed to come to the throne. He was not the heir. His brother was. Well, his brother ascended to the throne. His brother married Catherine of Aragon and died very shortly thereafter. So Henry comes to the throne. He's actually several years younger than either Catherine or his brother. And he comes to the throne and marries Catherine as well. Well, he and Catherine have a daughter whose name is Mary. And they go on about life or whatnot. Well, until something happens. Well, something doesn't happen, actually. You see, Catherine, while she produces a daughter, seems to be unable to produce a male heir for Henry. And Henry is getting a little bit long in years and deciding, I need a male heir so that can take my throne when I'm gone. I want to continue my name. I don't want my dynasty to end right here. And so he decides, you know what, it's my wife. It has to be, of course. That's what it has to be, right? And so Henry decides he wants to divorce his wife. So he says, look, here's the deal. He goes to the Pope and he says, look, here's the deal. My wife was my brother's wife as well. And the Bible says that you shall not have your brother's wife. Therefore, our marriage was never genuine in the sight of God. Can I please have my marriage annulled? Well, Catherine is asked about that. Were you his brother's wife? And she says, yes, I was, but we never consummated the marriage. She and Henry's brother never consummated the marriage. And so therefore it wasn't real. It wasn't final. So the Pope says, the Pope also hears from the King of Spain, who says, look, if you allow this divorce to happen, then you're going to have problems with Spain, because that's my daughter that's up there, and that's my granddaughter who's the princess. Well, so the Pope says, nope, we can't do that. No can do. The marriage stands. Well, Henry doesn't like that answer. And so he decides what he's going to do is not be the defender of the faith. He's not going to abide by the Pope's rule. And he says, okay, you don't want to grant me a divorce for this unlawful marriage? What I'm going to do is I'm going to take over all of the church's properties in England. He says, I'm the King of England. The Catholic Church needs to get out of England. Take a hike. And so he kicks the Catholic Church out of England. And he takes it over. He seizes the property, and he institutes what's known today as the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. And he sets himself, the English monarch, at the head of the church. He puts himself as the head of the church. And so And then he promptly grants his own divorce and marries Anne Boleyn, from who produces him a son, that would be Edward, and a daughter, Elizabeth. And so that is instructive to other monarchs who then follow suit and are not afraid to challenge the church's authority in the political realm as well. Of course, as history would have it, when soon after Henry dies, Edward comes to the throne, but he dies very quickly. Then Mary, Henry's first daughter, comes back from Spain and tries to take over. She earns the moniker Bloody Mary because she starts killing everybody in England, all the Anglican priests and everybody who sides with the Church of England. She begins running all the Protestants out of England and kills quite a few of them, so she earns the title of Bloody Mary. Well, those English middle class and nobles, they all go to Switzerland, where they end up encountering the Swiss Reformation, which was actually largely successful under Ulrich Zwingli and later John Calvin and those who would follow him. They begin learning that brand of Reformation theology. Well, Bloody Mary eventually gets displaced by her half-sister Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth. And she's kicked back out of Spain. Then all of the people who were, all the nobles who went to Switzerland, come back to England, and they bring that theology with them, and they become what is known as the Puritans, because they want to purify the Catholic Church, or not the Catholic Church, the English Church, the Anglican Church. So Queen Elizabeth now is reigning, and Elizabeth doesn't care one way or the other for religion, but she has to be Protestant. She has to be Protestant because if she allows Catholicism in her lands, then that's a way of saying that the marriage between Catherine and her father Henry was legitimate. If the marriage was legitimate, then the actual heir should be Mary. So to legitimize her own reign, she sides with the Church of England. And carries on from there. Well, the rest is history as it is. But anyway, what we see in this little escapade, this historical escapade, is we see that the church is challenged. The church is challenged also, not just in relation to science, their authority of science, their authority of theology. They are challenged also in terms of their political authority or political clout. And so here's the net effect at the end of all of this, and that will take us into when we'll be looking at epistemology and some other areas of philosophy, and as the philosophy gets into the Enlightenment area. But the net effect of all of this, the church is divested of its ability to speak authoritatively on science, theology, and politics. Their authority has been stripped from them, and now this institution has been relegated to almost marginal thing in society. Whereas before it was the bulwark that explained everything to people, that gave everybody a meaning and a purpose, that defined what your ethics and your morals and taboos would be culturally, and that gave direction not only to people religiously but also politically, as the church was a powerhouse when it came to a political force to be reckoned with. Now that's all a vacuum. And there's no, what you had counted on, if you were living in that day, what you had counted on is to provide for you some sense of stability in a universe that seems to be chaotic. Now the rug has been pulled out from underneath you, and you're left tumbling, and you don't know which way is up. You don't know what is true or false, what is good or bad, what is, who has the right to rule and who doesn't. And everything is up for grabs. And that is the cultural place at the beginning of the period that is known as the Enlightenment. And we will look at the Enlightenment on a later video. But that is the result, or this is sort of the place in history that brings us to the point of enlightenment. Here at the beginning of the Enlightenment, the pervading thought in society is that we cannot trust the traditional authorities to define the universe for us. If we are going to find any sort of certainty in knowledge, or any certainty for science, or any certainty for morals or ethics, any certainty for purpose and meaning, we have to look outside of the traditional authorities. And of course, they would equate the traditional authorities as with the church, with religion in many cases, and so forth. And so that's what happens, and human beings begin to look to themselves rather than looking at a transcendent source of meaning and purpose and value. And that's really the first time in recorded history that people had begun to do that as a whole culture. Now we see all kinds of people through the ages, here and there, little groups of people who kind of held this sort of worldview. But even this is where we see the trajectory being set for the modern day world, in which the sources of knowledge or the authorities of knowledge are largely fragmented. When anybody can go and make truth claims and be heard by people all across the globe, that's the world that we live in now. How do we ever find certainty of knowledge in such a setting? Well, and that's what's caused many people today to be skeptics in terms of coming to an ultimate statement of truth or a statement of ultimate truth. So anyway, that's our historical sketch. That's what brings us up to what will be known as the Enlightenment, which ushers in the modern era, which ushers in what I would say that we're in right now is the pre-modern era. And we will look at those each in turn separately on their own. But yeah, that is the historical sketch that brings us up to the Enlightenment period. And we will see you in the next video to start discussing philosophers who started out the Enlightenment, what the Enlightenment project was, and then how did that fare toward the end of the Enlightenment. We'll see that in a future video. Thank you very much. We'll see you then.